Hello and welcome to this, the fifth and the final program in the series, An Act of Great Courage, as we continue to celebrate the season of emancipation. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, thanks for your time. In previous programs, we discussed the conditions that led to the rebellion, issues, the contested leaders, and the actual rebellion. In this week's program, we shall discuss the aftermath and the legacy. Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, leads the discussion.
But the 1820s, the decade after the rebellion, was a decade in which Barbados now became the opposition to emancipation. Now, how do we get there? The British government and the slave owners in Britain and the absentee owners who are living in Britain, if the mother of all colonies has gone up in flames, Barbados, the showpiece has been burnt down, how are you going to imagine the future of a system if the model has been destroyed? So within the next decade, the conversations in Britain is, my God, Barbados. No, we couldn't have imagined Barbados. So now we have lost Barbados ideologically. The system is over. It is over. Slavery is over. All you can do to maintain it now is even more repression. So the British government now realizing that Barbados has gone up, the one place that they could show slavery is viable, slavery is sustainable, it has a long future, Barbados. But that argument is now destroyed because the people in Barbados have gone up in rebellion. So therefore, ideologically, slavery is over.
Could you imagine that? We're in the late 1820s. The foundation of the world's slave society is shaken. Where do we go from here? What do the plantocracy do?
All you can do now is bring more soldiers and more soldiers and more soldiers. But that will carry costs. It's going to bring tremendous costs. And if you bring any more repression, then you now have another set of issues to deal with. Because the murders that took place in Barbados in the decade after the 1816 rebellion was so disturbing of the British political mind, so that when you read the Hansard, when you read the British parliamentary discussion, what you're hearing in those records is, okay, Barbados has gone up in rebellion. We never expected it. It's our colony of choice. It's the home of the slavery system. The Africans who led this rebellion have been killed, but the constant reprisals and the constant year after year after year execution of people, the British Parliament is frankly embarrassed by it. And thus you see some speeches in the British Parliament where the English are now saying, we are embarrassed that those people in Barbados who are our descendants, the slave owners, we are embarrassed by their savagery. So the savagery of the white Barbadians becomes a debating theme in the British Parliament.
And how do we know all of that? Of course, it's through documented evidence. The Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, went directly to the source of this documented evidence, preserved in heritage institutions in the UK.
So it's interesting to read the Hansard, where the English politicians are distancing themselves from the savagery of the Barbadians. And the Barbadians are responding, the Barbadian slave owners are responding, and what they're saying is, we are the ones who built this slavery system. And when we built it, you, the British government, were happy with us. When the profits were high and the profits were flown back to England, you told us, go on, keep going. But now that we have our first rebellion, you're backing away from us, and you're saying that we are savages. So the British parliamentary discourse becomes a conflict between the British parliamentarians and the Barbados House of Assembly. So eventually, when the British Parliament said, enough is enough. Enough is enough. Barbados has gone up. It was the place we expected least. It is over. Let us legislate emancipation, shut it down. Barbados slave owners were the ones who said, absolutely not. We are going to defend this system to the very end. And in the end, the British government had to ram it down their throats.
Evidently, it was a bitter pill to swallow. And yes, it is somewhat paradoxical. One might conclude that it appears as if they were inspired by the might, the force, and the tenacity displayed during the 1816 rebellion. They fought the British government to the end.
So whereas all the other islands, Antigua, Jamaica, and the colony, Guyana, all of the other colonies legislated emancipation, we were instructed by the British government to pass legislation in our parliament to end slavery. The Barbados slave owners said that will never happen. And the Barbados slave owners refuse to legislate emancipation. So the last colony in the British Empire to accept that slavery was over was the place where it started. The place where it started, Barbados, was the place where it ended last. And even then, it took a lot of threats from the British government. As you know, the Emancipation Act had agreed to compensate the slave owners. Market value, replacement value, all your African enslaved people. The only reason the Barbados Parliament finally agreed that slavery was over was because the British government said, if you don't legislate the end of it, you will not get your compensation money. And it was that threat that eventually they said, okay, we need the money, and therefore we will legislate. And all of that because of Bussa, the rage and the anger in Barbados over what Bussa had done. Because Bussa and that 1816 rebellion was the rebellion, in my assessment, that brought the whole house down. Yes, the Sam Sharp rebellion in Jamaica, 1830-31, coming 2 years before the Emancipation Bill, that pushed it over the hill. There's no doubt the Sam Sharp revolution of Jamaica pushed it over the hill. But it was the Bussa rebellion that broke the back of British slavery.
Could we say another first for Barbados? Broke the back of slavery. Ambassador to CARICOM David Comachon speaks about commemorative efforts and how we ought to remember these martyrs whose sacrificial efforts are still felt today.
These are names that we should revere. Just as we have a cenotaph in Bridgetown listing the names of Barbadians who perished fighting in the First and Second World Wars, we should have memorials to all of these martyrs. We know some of the names, we don't know all of the names, but the names that we do know, the names from the 1675 rebellion, Hammond and Sambo and Ben and Coffee. Coffee was the leader that in 1675 our ancestors had planned to make him the king of Barbados. That was to be our real king, Coffee. And so we can go through the historical records and we can find the names of these heroes, these martyrs who made a sacrifice so that future generations would live in a better Barbados, would live in a situation of freedom. And I think it is really incumbent on us to memorialize those names and to annually pay homage to those freedom fighters. And you know, those plantations, I hear talk about how we should use those plantations. And you hear talk about, that these are cultural assets that should be turned into places to attract international business companies or places of recreation. I would like Barbadians to understand that the very first concentration camps were not in Nazi Germany. The very first concentration camps were right here in Barbados. Those slave plantations were veritable concentration camps. They were self-enclosed, prison-like structures where the most horrendous punishments were visited upon our ancestors, where life was nasty, short, and brutish. There was a time in our history where it was calculated that the life of a slave was to be 6 years, that you could work that slave to death in 6 years and make good on your investment.
It is an aspect of our history that brings absolutely no pleasure. Now back to the plantation. How should they be celebrated? How should they be used?
We therefore have to be very careful how we treat these plantations. I think one of the ways we should approach these plantations is to ensure that we construct on each of these plantations. We need to do the research. We need to find the ancestors who were associated with heroic acts of resistance on these plantations. And then we need to construct memorials to those ancestors and to those inspiring acts of heroism. So I'm saying that those plantations should become symbols of resistance, of inspiring resistance, but they cannot be trivialized. They cannot or should not be our people's history should not just be callously discarded. We should not trample on the graves of our ancestors. Our great Pan-Africanist scholar in Barbados, Dr. Viola Davis, she has written a book warning us about trampling on the graves of our ancestors. So I would really like to see a national program to memorialize our history by using the plantations as sites for such memorials. But I would put the emphasis on heroic resistance. So when we go to, and Bailey's plantation is a good example. Eddie Grant has already done exactly that at Bailey's. We have to be grateful to Eddie Grant, the great Guyanese musician who came to Barbados in the early 80s, made Barbados his home, discovered Bailey's plantation in a decrepit condition, purchased it, redeveloped it, and if you go to Bailey's, you will see the inscriptions. You will see where the role of Bussa and the role of Bailey's in that Bussa rebellion has been memorialized. So we have a model. What Eddie Grant has done at Bailey's in memorializing the heroic resistance tradition of Bailey's and the enslaved freedom fighters who were associated with Bailey's, that should be replicated on plantations all across Barbados.
As painful as this might be for some, it is a fine example of how we could celebrate our past. Historian Bobby Morris, like the others, he tells us how it could be celebrated. What is worthy of note is his suggestion as to how we could use the talents of our young people. and the fundamental role that the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation ought to play in all of this.
I figure it should be a multicultural kind of activity. In other words, I think that let's start with young people. You should ask the young people in schools, ask the teachers to teach about Buster, the revolution and what it meant, etc. Do quizzes, get people to do essays, get community college students paint in their painting classes, with Roger Giddens with his fantastic thing that he's doing in teaching music, get to develop musical themes and sort of things. So in other words, everything that conduces to cultural development should be done on that day, calypso, whatever. But it has to be a multi-purpose day where right now it is not a holiday, you see? That's the thing about it. And I don't think you're going to ask anybody to do it a holiday because it won't make sense. Again, you already had the holiday for the heroes. But it should be a commemorative day. And I think we should have at CBC, can host discussions, etc., bring people with diverse views to talk about their perception about Buster, who he was, etc. The problem we have is that there's nobody who's alive now that would have that connection. You know, because even if you're 100 years old, you're still born in 19-something, 100 years after. But who knows? There might be somebody who will be able to tell you where my great-grandfather was, came off of something, because we never asked sufficient. But maybe we should do that, trying to find people that came out of St. Philip at our time.
It underscores the importance of research. This is therefore a call for anyone to conduct the research and see where it leads. The Department of Archives in Black Rock welcomes all of you.
If you didn't sacrifice, you can't be my hero. So when I look at men like Buster, he might lost his life. Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin was the only man that was hanged, court-martialed and hanged. And we can say he is not. Why? Why? And to me, the notion that has pushed that, man, he's a colored man. He got some weight in him, so how we can make him a hero? It's a strange thing. Because I disagree, to some extent, with Hoyas and those others pushing him to the detriment of Buster. They never used to talk about Buster, basically. They would be Franklin. But we, who did the research for both, know that both have a place. That's my own view, quite frankly. And to keep shutting out Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin is, to me, a huge error of judgment in terms of a Creole society. Creole society really should not be based on color. If people ask me, do I have a white hero? He couldn't be in the days of when they owned plantations, slavery, etc. That will write you off completely. But is it possible that there's a white hero? Why not? If he sacrificed for the whole good, that's where you have to come and show me. That the person has sacrificed for the good of my country. For us here as Barbadians, his color wouldn't matter at all. It really would not matter.
Historian Bobby Morris celebrates and honors the role of the leaders of this rebellion. Of course, he emphasizes his unwavering support of Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin.
I'm of the view, quite frankly, that one, we've been very disrespectful to Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin. My position is this. I'm not going to consider a hero or not a hero because you got a light skin. And I want my hero to be black and African and born in Africa. Make no sense to me whatsoever. If Buster happened to be a Creole, born in Barbados, I would feel just as proud or maybe even prouder, rather than that he's an African. Because it would show that the Creole Barbadian had started to get a sense of himself as owning the place. So how can I go on only one man's word that he was an African. In other words, what else would you call him? Because once you're black, you're an African. So the African title that they gave to him, to me, was as a generic title. He was an African. But when Horace was born in Africa, I said, God, how can you do that? Show me the facts. And nobody had shown me the facts that he was born in Africa. So here we go now and starts an interpretation. He would have to be bringing about this time and so on. So that is now history that you're making. But history does allow for assumptions. Eh? You can make assumptions. That is true. Show me the facts. And there's nothing wrong to say, we don't know. But as soon as you start justifying by what you think, it causes a little concern to me. Right? So I know that there were bustles, little bustles, etc. But I can't tell you directly that that was the bustle, although we believe so. But it will not be bold enough to say he was definitely born on those plantations, raised on those plantations. But I'm saying, if I didn't find him there, you can say that was there. So there's a judgment now about whether they're the same bustles that grew up. You would have to judge yes or no. But when you have no facts, etc., other than a man in 1913 saying, one man, that he was in Africa, and then another man then, in 1971 or so, adding on, born in Africa. Oh my God, that can't be what history is for me.
Historian Bobby Morris with strong conviction. This is indeed good television. Now, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, on the way forward. How do we celebrate this? He first uses the example of a nation in the northwestern Caribbean.
Why not Bussa High School? Why not Bussa Circle? Where does it go now to take that purity through the minds of successive generations? So those are questions that we have to ask. In Jamaica, they took that step. There is Sam Sharp High School, and generations of young people are coming up through the pedagogy of being graduates of Sam Sharp High School. Why have we not yet taken that step to embed the pure form in institutions, other than the theoretical construct of national hero? It has to move from national hero into community, into social institutions, into social living, where young children are going to school with their uniforms and they have the Bussa crest, and they're going to a school that has his image on the wall, and that is how you move to the pure form. And we're not there yet, and I suspect it has to do with the fact that we need to be realistic about the depth of what black Barbadians have had to go through. If you are at the center of a model, and that model is the perfection of a slavery system, and you are the descendants of that, it will take a lot of time to take away the emotional dimensions. Compare Barbados and Britain. It's always important to compare societies of first. England becomes the first industrial nation. England is the first nation on the planet that moved away from agriculture and built an industrial complex as the future. The future of civilization is going to be industry, manufacturing, factories, production. England pioneered that. That consciousness is so embedded in the English mind that we are the nation who pioneered this world. We are the nation who built the first global factories. We are the nation who built the biggest banks. We're the nations who had the majority of people working in industry. The English people have that built now into their DNA as to who they are. Now, Barbados is the first slave complex. The first place where this model was built, refined, made sophisticated, and worked for 200 years. The descendants of that model are still struggling with the cultural legacy of it. So while the British are so confident that they pioneered the Industrial Revolution and took humanity into an industrial age, we the Barbadians are carrying the burden of our legacy of being the descendants of the people who were first crushed by slavery, but who rose up against that and created what I call the mother of all revolutions. Right there in the center of that system of evil, the people on this island were able to rise up and say to the world, you thought that we were crushed, but look what has happened. We're not. Now, that sends a message of confidence. So now we have two legacies in Barbados. In Barbados, we have a legacy of being the descendants of people who were at the center of the greatest evil known to humankind. And we were the ones who carried it on our backs with the greatest intensity. But we also have a legacy of being the ones who fought against it. And that legacy is also important, that somewhere in our minds, we can mobilize to destroy any system that we consider to be evil. So we have two cultural traditions in our DNA. And that is what gives us hope.
And that ought to be celebrated. Let us use it to the advantage of all Barbadians and show the world. That brings us to the end of an act of great courage as we celebrate the season of emancipation. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, thank you very much for your time.